prayers, or he laughs and jests with his servants, angels in disguise, sweetly and play the flute. Then he has his long hair comb and is anointed with nard. You know what nard is? It sounds like lard, but you know what nard is? I'll send him a fact check it for me. N-A-R-D. And dressed in crimson purple. All afternoon he studies the Kabbalah. Oh, he's doing that Siri. That's so disruptive. At any rate, I'm going to switch it around.
You can get up?
Yes. Called nard. Nard is aromatic aromatic essential oil as a perfume. Okay, Alexander, the Latvians want to hear the resurrection. Okay. But what's interesting here is his thank you very much. His transvaluation of the role of the Messiah. He portrays not the Jews as anxiously waiting for the Messiah, but the Messiah as anxiously waiting to come to the world. And the Messiah is growing impatient with this world and demands to be loosed on the world to bring about his messianic redemption. But he is held fast with golden chains. Fascinating kind of metaphor. And you can hear the Jewish Shmuel just. He wasn't
This is the messenger.
as a whole, so his legacy to conclude a fascinating individual with a very ready wit. Despite his conversion, maintaining a very long and deep, abiding love for Judaism, and it speaks to the kind of complexities of Jewish identity in the 19th century. An identity that I think very much still holds fast today, as many secular Jews find it difficult to understand exactly what place does Torah have in the modern world. Haida articulated it so well in his beautiful poetry and prose. He was able to express the longing for Judaism in the way that he imagined it, even though he did not necessarily conform to what he saw around him in contemporary Judaism. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the costume tonight, and I look forward to speaking with you next week. It's a flower. Oh.
With Richard in charge, the old guard probably fear the worst. But getting the power he's always craved seems to calm him down.
It's a big thing.
Astonishing.
Big commercial.
King agrees intrusive friends.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry for the slight delay tonight. We have a change in personnel, as you may have noticed. Mr. Rodriguez is unfortunately for us out of town this week, but I have appointed my son Alexander to take his place, stand up and face everyone here. So we'll see how well he does with the actual filming, and actually everyone out there in Latvia. We'll see soon how good my son is at doing this kind of thing. Tonight's topic is quite fascinating, something that's close to my own intellectual interest, although I've never actually looked into this biography in much detail, so I learned quite a bit preparing for tonight's class. We're going to look at Rabbi Israel Lipkin of Salat, often known as Israel Salater, the Israel from the town of Salat, who is credited with the foundation of the modern Musar movement. So we'll have a discussion of what exactly that means, the Musar movement, and we'll look at his life in general. And I think we'll see he's one of those really creative figures of the 19th century, a period of tremendous creativity, explosion of ideas among Jews in Europe on how to reevaluate Judaism in the context of modern times and adapt it appropriately to the concerns of those regions in which the Jews lived. I'll start with a small joke, which it makes more sense to tell this joke at the end of class, but since I assume that most of you have at least some familiarity with what Musar is, the joke will make sense. So just to give you a little bit of contextual information, Musar as a school of study is often associated, rightly or wrongly, as we shall see throughout the next 60 minutes, with the rather harsh, self-critical attitude, as a form of ethical development through unrelenting self-criticism and examination of one's flaws, and through
the monkey?
one presumably
No,
able
she-
to conquer those weaknesses and then go on to spiritual greatness. That's, in a nutshell, kind of what the popular understanding of what Musar is. As we shall see, there are some distinctions, but let's just work with that. So the joke goes like this. It's 19th century Lithuania. I'll tell you, move the camera when I move. That's a little faster, right? I'm over here. So it's 19th century Lithuania, and this is an era where there's the Haskalah is very active, the Hasidic movement is very active, and the Musar movement is taking shape as well. So a Chassid from, let's say, southern Ukraine decides he wants to visit a Musar house, a base Musar, a place where they study Musar, a yeshiva from Musar. He wants to understand what exactly do they do there. So he walks into the base Musar, the house of Musar, and he sees there's a few guys sitting alone by the walls, and they're hunched over little tiny books, looking into them and wiping their foreheads and worrying about who they are. And here's one of them saying, "Oi, it's been garnished. I'm nothing." And then he looks over and sees another guy says, "Oi, it's been ganz garnished. I'm entirely nothing," right? So the Chassid says, "Well, I'll give it a try." He goes to the wall, and Hasidism, of course, does not have a comparable modality of study, as we'll discuss later. He pulls off a copy of Mesilas Yesharim, one of the great Musar classics, and he starts reading, and he starts realizing, you know what? Yeah, ich bin euch garnished. I'm also garnished. I'm jealous, I'm vain, I'm petty, I think about my pride, my arrogance, and he's going on and on and on. Move the camera, there we go. He's going on and on, and he starts saying it out loud. Ich bin garnished, von garnished. I'm completely valueless. And the other two guys look at each other. One of them says, "Who's the big shot that thinks he's garnished?" Okay, all right, it sort of makes sense. Let's look at the life of this very fascinating individual. As I've said, he is credited with being the founder of the Musar movement. It's important to note that Musar as a modality of study, or I shouldn't say that, as a topic of study, goes back at least 800 years. You can see Bach Ibn Hakuda, I mentioned already, great works, like actually if you look at a different context, the works of Maimonides, the Shmona Prokim, there are many, many works that considerably antedate the activity of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. His innovations, as we shall see shortly, really consist in terms of a refocusing, a reframing of many of these classics of Jewish ethical literature, and a systematization of its study within the formal curriculum of the yeshiva. He, as an individual, did not achieve all of his goals, and in fact, he was plagued through most of his life with an acute depression that followed him to the very end of his days in 1883. He was unable to escape it. He was especially sad that, at least in his lifetime, Musar did not take flight as a mass movement. It did not shape itself in the way that he had hoped it would. But nevertheless, immediately after his passing, the second or third generation of the students really did transform it into a very significant movement. And in fact, it is virtually synonymous with the entire yeshivic world today, so to speak. The Lithuanian Talmudic world today associates very profoundly with this man's thought and his methodology. So we're going to look at his life and try to understand the impact of his thought in Jewish culture. I'm going to rely very heavily on this workbook by Emmanuel Edges. I have the virtual version, I have the actual version here. I've had this on my bookshelf for a long time, and I never really got around to reading it in detail, and I found it absolutely fascinating. It's a great historiographic overview of many of the earlier, more popular and hagiographic treatments of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and places them a lot in a modern historiographic context. So I highly recommend Professor Edge's work if you'd like to go into this and further. I'm basically going to plagiarize my entire lecture on his work here.
Oh, this thing scary as fuck.
Quick refresher, the term Mishnah means opponent, and that term was created really as a result of the Hasidic revolution the traditionalist Talmudic schools opposed the development of Hasidism,
Jump scare
and
to
as a
come as
result,
you're
they
gonna show.
became known as the
Yeah.
opponents. One of the great,
Why?
thank you, everyone at Latvia knows this word. One of the great challenges of the international world in the early 19th century, something that they really did not truly overcome until the 20th century, was to define for themselves a positive reason for being. Meaning they took their very name and in many ways their essence from their opposition to another movement rather than stating what they actually believed in properly. They lost the PR war for most of the 19th century, trying to say, well, what do we stand for besides being against what they stand for, which is kind of I'm not going to take a joke on that one. But at any rate, so there's next year we'll talk about Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, one of the principal teachers of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who made a concerted effort to try and change that PR balance and say something positive about the Mitnagdic movement. But this was a period in which the Mitnagdic were very much in full retreat from two major social intellectual movements that were sweeping through Eastern Europe in the 19th century. On the one hand, Hasidism, already mentioned and discussed in previous lectures, and on the other hand, the Haskalah, which was making really, the Jewish Enlightenment, the modernizing and often secularizing movement that was making significant gains in Eastern Europe. So the traditional Talmudists, the Mitnagdim, they were really Mitnagdim to two different movements. Really, they were opposing Hasidism, they were opposing Enlightenment, and they were also at the same time struggling to define their own identity at the same time. So he fell into that particular movement in the period of its greatest struggle. His major influences were, of course, the person who was associated more than anyone else with the Mitnagdic movement, the Vilna Gaon himself, and his principal student, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, who attempted to articulate a strategy of dealing with the Hasidic movement by, if you can't beat them, join them, principally through his great work Nefesh HaChaim, which is essentially Kabbalah for Mitnagdim. It is an acknowledgement of the fact that part of the major reason for the success of the Hasidic movement was that they tapped into the huge body of rich theosophic ideas and translated them to the common person in Eastern Europe. So, and the Mitnagdim had reserved all of those ideas for only the most elite scholars. So, in a very different way than the Hasidic movement, Rabbi Chaim tried to bring those Kabbalistic ideas in a format that would be acceptable to Talmudic studies, Talmudic students in the early 19th century. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, ironically, would reject that strategy, as we shall see shortly. But his principal teacher was a man named Yosef Zundel, who many consider a hidden tzaddik. He was a person who had no official rabbinic position, but was widely regarded as a tremendously righteous individual and an extremely learned individual. And many of the techniques of learning and of personal development were things that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter really absorbed and focused on in his own work. One of the famous stories about Rabbi Yosef Zundel is, he was famous for being very humble. And at one point, he was traveling through Lithuania. He stopped at one particular home, and by the way, he avoided all of the traditional garb of the rabbinic elite. He tried to dress like a common person, wearing regular workman's clothes, in good repair according to halacha and so on. But he tried very much not to appear as a giant of Torah. And it happened that he was traveling once, and he stopped in at the home of a particular rabbi, and they began to engage in a discussion of Talmud and so on, and they had to talk back and forth. And this particular rabbi said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Salant." And he said, "Oh, you must know Rabbi Yosef Zundel. How is he doing?" He says, "Yes, he's doing well, thank you." And he's talking to Rabbi Yosef Zundel. And he says, "He is such an amazing chassid. He's such a chassid in the sense of pious. He's such an amazingly pious and learned individual," going on and on praising him. And Yosef Zundel was in a difficult position because on the one hand, he couldn't exactly acknowledge that it was he was talking to because he wanted to not draw attention to himself and his own identity. And on the other hand, he couldn't exactly disagree and say, no, he's not such and such, but he was trying to downplay things and so on. And finally, the rabbi stopped for a minute and said, Yosef,
Just have enough idea.
as my daughter likes to say, my eldest daughter, you got bagel means. Bageling is like when someone spots you and acknowledges your Jewish identity on the street. I don't know why it happens to me all the time. But anyways, that was his principal teacher. He did not have the opportunity to learn with them for very long, but they once asked him, why was Rabbi Yosef Sundel your teacher? He didn't have a yeshiva, he didn't have a shtela, he didn't have a rabbinical placement, he was just a regular laborer and so on. Why was he your teacher? And Rabbi Yisrael Salanter responded in Yiddish, Ich hab ihm einmal gesehen. I saw him once, and that was enough. Just to see Rabbi Yosef Sundel was enough to inspire me with that's the kind of Jew I want to become. So to give you a sense, hang on one second, I'll get right to you. To give you a sense of the development of his thought, we're going to look at the arc of his ideas in great detail. But in his youth, with one of his study partners, he made 3 resolutions, which tell you a little bit about where his mind is going to go over the next 40-odd years. His first resolution was not to serve in the rabbinate. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter resolved never to take a position of communal authority, which was a very hard thing for him to adhere to, because in many different towns, from Lithuania to France, people were begging him to please take charge of our community, please be the leader, the spiritual, the moral, the halachic leader of our community. And quite on, although he never, to my mind, I don't think he ever took an actual rabbinical post as per his resolution. He took many positions of communal leadership and spiritual moral authority. But the idea behind this resolution was that he wanted to simply earn his living from other things, from whatever, he tried to learn how to make meat, for example. At one point he tried to stick to the Maimonidean idea of earning a living like a regular person and studying the Torah as your pastime and your pleasure, but really you did not rely on Torah for your parnasa. Secondly, he undertook never to write books, and the idea was he wanted to avoid any fame that would associate with being a great author. He did publish quite a bit. Most of it, however, were things like his sermons, which were later transcribed by his students, and then he would authorize their publication. Short materials like the Igeret HaMusar, the letter of Musar that he sent to his students from Europe into Russia, and he published a journal called TRUMAN, a very important, short-lived but very important journal, but he never wrote a single solid word from start to end under his own authorship. He was really always through these other media. And again, to avoid his trappings of fame. And the third thing is he resolved never to study Kabbalah, which is something that is such a contrast to the Hasidic world, and even a contrast to that kind of position of retreat, strategic retreat that Rabbi Volozhin had advocated. The direction of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's Musar was, look, it's very simple. God told us what we're supposed to do. We have it in the Talmud, and we have it especially in the Shulchan Aruch. Our job is just to figure out what God wants and adhere totally to that message. He was very big in studying halakha, and he was actually quite innovative in understanding the application of halakha in very unusual realms. As I'm going to show you a little later, his application of halakha made it more than merely transactional, commercial kind of a body of law or a ritual law. It was very much a law of morality. You can see the threads of a deep-rooted, abiding morality in all of halakha, according to the way that he studied it. And he felt that Kabbalah was kind of a distraction from the main goal, which was to fulfill the will of God. And he placed a tremendous amount of emphasis on Yiras Hashem, the fear of God. He said that's really what we're dealing with entirely. It's kind of like that. That's why some people have tend to associate Muslim with a fundamentally negative aspect. And that's true, I think, in some schools of Muslim definitely follow this aspect. But other schools say, no, this is a tremendous release in the sense that, we have our rule book, we have the goals that we're supposed to achieve. We have. The behavior is supposed to emulate, and that's all we have to worry about. It's clear. And as the Talmud says, or actually the Ramah says, "Ein simcha keheter hasfekot." There is no happiness comparable to the resolution of doubt. Once you have clarity, you have great happiness. Okay, Ms. Abramson, please. Ms. Abramson, you never fail to uplift me with your intellectually stimulating questions. For all of you in Latvia, Ms. Abramson asked, if I can paraphrase, wait a minute, everything I know and my whole Jewish education has been so central to it. That's at least, in my Lithuanian, yeshivish surroundings, that's what we do. What did they do before Rabbi Yisrael Salata? So that's exactly the point. Musar was not part of the curriculum. First of all, yeshivas, as we understand them today, did not exist. They're more like disciple circleships, and it was under a kind of a Volozhin, right? The teacher of Rabbi Yisrael Salata, who set up the first formal yeshiva. But people studied the Talmud and the codes. They generally not studied the great works of Musar. Those were things for individuals. It was kind of like a hobby. We were interested in studying that, but it was not considered required at all. And as we shall see, the yeshivas opposed the Muslim movement. And they said, we can't have this. So it's going to be a good lecture. Just stay with it.
Chicago Blair. Chicago pickup Blair. Shut the Chicago pickup Blair. Really, yeah.
Except for perhaps some of the publication of other works of Musar. I don't know. See his name associated with it. Perhaps you can clarify for me after the lecture why you're thinking so. But let's go on because we've got a lot of stuff to talk about. Okay, so let's first understand Russian Jewry under Nicholas I. Let's place this in a social and economic context, which was absolutely horrific. Some of the worst excesses against Jews were perpetrated under the leadership of this man, Tsar Nicholas I. He came to the throne in 1825 after his father was murdered in the War of Revolt, and he was an extremely authoritarian and militaristic leader of Russia. He felt that all the problems of Russia could be solved by forcing the situation and demanding that everyone conform to his ideas of what the state should be like. Russia is, of course, a very different country nowadays. Pause for laughter, right? Okay. This is Tsar Nicholas I, and unfortunately, that is tremendously awful repercussions for Jews. Now, consider it from this perspective. The Jews have just been incorporated into the Russian Empire really only 50 years prior, with the conquest of Poland under Catherine II. And up until this point, the Jews have remained an indigestible mass sitting in the western provinces who are not converting to Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, not learning the Russian language, not really sort of blending with the population and adopting agricultural practices of the local peasants. And he's wondering, what can I do with these people? He's considering that perhaps they're a fifth column, perhaps they're going to ally themselves with the Germans, all these kinds of things. So he adopts a complex strategy with many different tactical expressions that were designed to assimilate the Jewish population into the Russian Empire. Perhaps the most odious of them was the notorious Cantonist policies, which were established in the 1830s and extended in one form or another right up until the 20th century. I'm sure you're familiar with these. Basically, this was a rule that the Jews had to supply a certain number of conscripts to the Russian army. They could not, as they had traditionally, simply pay an additional tax to have Jews exempted from the army. They must, in fact, comply with numbers. And Nicholas I's idea was that the army is the best way to assimilate the Jews into Russian society. You take a certain percentage of them, That way, for sure, they'll learn the Russian language. They'll probably convert to Russian Orthodoxy. They'll develop patriotism, civic identity, and so on. He recognized, however, that by the time they were born, I should mention, by the way, the term of service in the Russian army was 25 years. It was not a 2 or 3 year conscription. It was basically a career choice that was favored by many Russian young men. If they were second or third sons, they had no chance of inheriting property. So they said, okay, I need to be a priest or I could go to the army. I'm going to try the army. It was a fair selection for them. But for Jews, 25 years serving among non-Jews in remote locations, it was basically a death sentence to their Jewish identity. But he realized that keeping the age of conscription at 18 would not achieve his objectives, because by the time the Jews reached that age, they had already had their bar mitzvah. Many of them were already married and with children by that age. They had already, had their fill of Chinese food, and they were not going back to Russian food. Pause for laughter. Thank you. There's uproarious laughter. All of you out there laughing. They are really laughing inside. They're laughing. Okay, my son is saying, "What are you doing now, Bob? What are you doing?" Okay. So at any rate, yeah, I know. I was talking about conscriptions, right? Oh, yes, right. So what he did was he lowered the age of conscription to 12. And the Jews who were conscripted at age 12, these boys, you see here, their children being about to be chopped by the community, would be delivered to these schools that were called cantons, apparently, or there were regions called cantons, and there they would be given indoctrination, often by Russian Orthodox priests, with a lot of coercion, separated from their parents, to simply convert to Christianity. And by the time they finished 6 years in the cantons, 25 years in the army, that was basically it for their Jewish identity. Amazingly, some did retain their self-identification as Jews, and once they were veterans of the Russian army, they had all of the residence exclusions were lifted for them. Many of them went to communities in Estonia and northern Latvia on the Baltic Sea, where you have these fascinating, at least until the Holocaust, when they were all killed, where you had these fascinating communities of ex-Cantonist conscripts and their offspring who were living in these resort regions. To make things even worse, Nicholas I placed the responsibility of choosing the conscripts on the Jewish communities themselves, the Jewish communal leadership known as the Kahal. And so the leadership exploited every possible loophole in the law, or use their power as much as possible to, unfortunately, prey on the weakest members of Jewish society. It was rarely children of the Kahal leadership who were sent off to the army. It was more typically the children of widows, orphans, children of vagrants who were sent off. In some cases, the Kahal actually employed individuals known as hoppers or kidnappers to take these children from their parents. Absolutely horrific. There's been a lot of study of this by Michael Stanislavski and others. And amazingly, the rabbinate failed to stand up and take a strong position on this. There's a lot of moralizing, a lot of folk songs that have come from the period, but the rabbis failed to take a strong leadership position condemning this, arguing any other kind of strategy. They were afraid for their own children as well. So it's a period of tremendous demoralization in the Jewish community, of feeling when the traditional leadership had failed the larger population, and so it was right for tremendous changes. Once again, the neighborhood. Yes, you're absolutely right. She's pointing out the prohibition, very serious prohibition against grieving an orphan or a widow. We'll see that in Rabbi Yisrael's launcher's thought as well. But as Rabbi Berelwein likes to say, you must never confuse Judaism with Jews. Second question. Yeah, well, you can only say that because you're not a parent. If you're a parent, you don't want to send any of your kids. And how do you decide with a 12-year-old kid? How are you going to say this kid is going to survive 36 years of service in the military? Stop. It's not going to work. Okay, let's go on. I'm going to make some more talk. Now, and finally, the third challenge, I'll get back to you in a second, also. The third challenge here is the Haskalah. As I mentioned earlier, the Haskalah is making great inroads into Russian Jewry in the 19th century. That's very different from what we saw when we talked about Berlin in the 18th century. The Haskalah in Eastern Europe remained much more, let's say, Jewish in character. There was far less of a movement towards assimilation. In Germany, because of the fight for emancipation, the tantalizing goal of achieving equal rights, meant that a lot of Jews said, you know what? Let's just reform Judaism down. Let's make it easier for non-Jews to appreciate it and understand it. And maybe by so doing, we will win their trust. They'll give us emancipation. They knew that was not happening in Russia at all. And of course, it didn't happen until 1917 when they had a revolution that got rid of Tsar. And they had more Tsuris. It's ironic that Tsar and Tsuris are very similar words. So what happens in Western Europe is the Haskalah becomes much more either Yiddishist or Hebraic. It develops into Zionism. But it does develop certain characteristics, such as, for example, an emphasis on civic duty, an emphasis on learning the language of the land. Russian was very important to the Hasidim at that time. Perhaps the greatest sign of the separation between the traditionalist communities and the Maskilim is that in Lithuania, in Vilna, they had to set up a separate minyan for the Maskilim. Separate minyan for the people who believe in Haskalah, right? It's not like they're setting up a separate shul with Shabbos on Sunday and not keeping kosher. They say, okay, you guys, if you insist on doing this, you have to dub it in a different room. That's all. The same liturgy, the exact same stuff. That was not in question at all. One last detail in connection with this, there was a way out of the conscription issue. If you didn't want your child to be liable to the conscription, you could put your child, as in the 1840s, into one of the new crown schools that is established by the Tsar. These were schools that were often staffed by Russian Orthodox priests in the secular department, but they had a Jewish department where you could study Chumash and Talmud and so on. And the idea was that for those Jews who would not be coerced to assimilate through the army, they would be offered the carrot of an educational opportunity, but in an approved environment. And this was actually quite a dire threat at the same time, because you could risk your child's physical well-being in the army, or you could risk their spiritual well-being in one of these official schools that were widely seen, justly so, as simply fronts for assimilation and conversion. It was under these circumstances that Salanter actually was offered the position of the head of one of these schools, and he simply chose to flee Lithuania rather than be associated with the school. So take it together. These kind of elements, we can go on and on, but it would take us far away from our main topic. This was a period of dire stress for Jews in Russia, for Lithuania in particular, but the Jews of the Russian Empire as a whole. Extremely discriminatory policies that threatened their youth, both physically and spiritually, and as we shall see, there are great economic pressures as well, and it was a period when people were looking for real leaders.
Remember Toshi?
A moral core, and really, Mr. Salanter filled that position. Mr. Abrams. After the Tsar was deposed in 1917 and the communists took over the 20th century. We'll come back in God willing after Passover. We'll get to the communist period. Yes, please. That's a good question. I haven't looked it up in a while. I would recommend you look at the work of Michael Stanislavski from Columbia, but I somehow think the number is in 5 figures. Probably tens of thousands, but I'm not positive. Yeah. My grandfather and he was going to accept one of these schools and followed things
I don't know what I was doing. This is exciting.
So as late as 1912, this was still going on.
Oh, that's amazing.
I can remove this kind of
my
like
son was named after my
steady
city
state.
who fled the Russian Empire because he did not want to fight against the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War.
That actually stopped my phone. And King off. I walked over the stage. Might do that, yeah.
No, Isaac Lewin or Kurt Lewin, I think. Oh, interesting. Okay, so let's go on more with the ROTHSCHILD. Let's talk about the idea of Musser. To give you some of the social historical background, let's talk more about his ideas. So, as Ms. Abramson asked about earlier, Musser goes a long way back into Jewish tradition. There are many different strands of Musser as a, well, first of all, what does the term mean? The root is masar, which means to hand over, as a sense of tradition. Masora is the word for tradition. Moser is someone who hands over a criminal to the authorities. You know, there are different terms for it, but it's basically something that is handed over. It has acquired this connotation of ethical development, perhaps because there's a verse in the book of Kohelet, book of Mishlei, Proverbs, which it says, you know, listen, my son, to the Musser of your father, and do not uproot the Torah of your mother.
They need to put in, like, they have these rivers in
it's like the rebuke of your father.
Europe and shit. They need to put up, like,
Corrections that your father is bound to give you. And there are many works that have focused on that aspect of
really? Europe is so
much. Some of them are a little bit more halakhic in orientation. Some are more Kabbalistic in orientation, like the Talmud Torah, which we'll return to a little later. And there's been kind of like a slow and steady stream of these kinds of works, especially after the publication of Masilat Yesharim in the mid-18th century by the phenomenal Rabbi, a work that was extremely important to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter is this by Rabbi Levin of Satanov, and it's actually a fascinating book. It bears remarkable similarity to the writings of Benjamin Franklin. Many have argued that.
Do you think Yosh should do that?
Benjamin Franklin's writings.
And he'd catch a bird on the way down. Really? What kind of bird? Like an eagle? Maybe like a mallard?
He had a role publishing it again in the 1840s, originally published in the 19th century. Looking at it a little bit wider, let's try to understand some of the big ideas of Muslim. And obviously, we spent a lot of time talking about this. We're speaking actually in a place where Rabbi Moshe Bernstein went to a yeshiva in the Rav here, who was steeped in Muslim. I mean, he learned more Muslim than most of us should have forgotten, I'm sure, because they really emphasize that. But just to touch on it briefly, one of the big ideas is tikkun hamidot, the repair of characteristics, the repair of personal, ethical positions. You know, we all have our petty selfishness, we all have our jealousies, we all have our greed, and so on. Sloth. And tikkun hamidot is perhaps the only real goal of Musser is to try and work on our ethical sensibilities, not on our understanding of the laws of, lost and found.
I love how these are always pictures on pictures.
Like it's really about personal development.
That's good enough.
Some Musser definitely emphasizes asceticism, meaning a separation from the world, fasting, self-flagellation.
Watch this, son.
Denial, self-denial, and many things. Not necessarily strong in Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's thought, but definitely a significant trend in the Ashkenazi of the 13th century onward. Very important, especially for Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, in his early roots, is the concept of habit. As the Vilna Gaon put it, quoting another great Muslim work of Rabbi Yonah, the Hergel al Kol Davar Shilton, regularity or habit consistency
that.
has power over everything. Good or bad,
Don't
if you
even
have a
line.
good habit, it can take care of any evil.
They
And if
didn't
you have
like
a bad habit, wow, it's incredibly hard to uproot it. So much of the discussion of Western literature is trying to address those bad habits and to transform them into good habits. One of the major significant elements that Rabbi Salanter really emphasized was the role of psychology, and I would say actually modern psychology in its applications of Western concepts. He was an eclectic thinker and reader. He never quite mastered German, but he read it fluently, French as well. And he read very widely the sciences of the 19th
Look at
century.
Beyblade into
This is
the
a period of Freud, and he published the interpretation of dreams in 1910, so it's really a nascent period for psychology. But, Rabbi Salanter is taking all of these new ideas in the mind, especially the burgeoning ideas of the unconscious, which Freud, of course, explored more than anyone else. But Salanter took these ideas and really applied them to the concept of Muslim. Very important for him. Also, it's important to place this in context. If you look at many of the earlier schools of Muslim, many of them look at the Yetzer Hara, the desire to do evil, as a concrete being of consciousness external to the person who, like, an evil influence, a mystical, demonic influence causes a person to do wrong. The devil made me do it, kind of thing. And while Rabbi Salanter would not openly contradict that model, he really worked on the emphasis of the idea of the Yetzer Hara being internalized, which also has deep roots in the Talmudic tradition. He's not making this stuff up, but he emphasized the internal motivation to do evil and really worked on a psychological appreciation of that. Some of his innovations in study, for example. So what did he do? He didn't really create a new school. He created a new way of learning this material, and he ensured that it was placed within the standard curriculum. He emphasized that Musar had to be studied not as an academic discipline, but with hitpa'alut. Hitpa'alut is hard to translate into English. Pa'al means to act, and hitpa'alut means to act upon oneself. Meaning that Musar has to be translated from words on a page to an internal understanding of the importance of the idea. He really emphasized emotional connections with words, and in so doing, for example, he emphasized the use of mantras, like verses from the Torah or statements from the Talmud that would be repeated over and over and over again, like a sing-song. As a way of reinforcing certain basic ideas. He said that the person should try and find a few verses that really speak to them themselves in terms of what they need to do with their lives, and they should make them something that they spend a fair bit of time every day meditating upon those verses, saying them out loud to try and reinforce these ideas in their mind.
I like
his target audience was rather immigrant. Most of the Musar literature prior to Salanter really was dedicated to an elite readership. People who were well versed in the Talmud, well versed in all studies, and this was kind of like reading plus, recommended reading. Rabbi Salanter said, no, those are not the people we have to reach out to. We have to reach out to ordinary householders, people who are making a living in business or in the professions, and reach out to those people who are not necessarily the leadership. In other words, he was definitely not an ivory tower kind of thinker. He felt that this should be something for, not exactly the common man, but for in fact, I shouldn't even say man, because he did emphasize that Musar is absolutely obligatory for women as well. And he enjoyed quite a resurgence of popularity among women because he felt that, this is not something that is, a character development is obviously for human beings, period. So he reached out to a female audience, which was, again, unusual for that time. And perhaps most famously, his thought characterizes a tendency to favor interpersonal relations over a relationship with God. This is unusual. Let me put that a different way. When faced with a choice between serving God and serving other people, obviously within the parameters of halakha will always favor certain other people. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. I'll give you an example of that. For example, here's a few examples. There's so many stories from this mantra, but I think my favorite 7. Okay, I'll go right back. So, for example, in 1848, there was a cholera epidemic in Lithuania, and there's certain different versions of this story. The one that's most widely circulated is that on Erev Yom Kippur, the day, no, it was on the morning of Yom Kippur, I'm sorry, the morning of Yom Kippur, the fast day, Rabbi Salanter got up onto the bima in shul and said the bracha and ate a sandwich. Everybody on Yom Kippur should see that it's more important that if you are not well, you must eat rather than face the risk of cholera. More modern versions of the story, which are probably closer to the truth, but not nearly as much fun to tell, is that he did get up on the bima and he announced the importance of
get him, RuPaul.
He's not feeling well, so he can't endanger their health. And in the side room, they had prepared some honey cake that was cut to below the minimum size to be the definition of eating. And he urged anyone who felt the need to eat to simply go into the other room and eat. That makes more benefits within the realm of halachic norms, so it's probably more true. Nevertheless, it's a good story. Another story coming up to Pesach. So he was once asked by his students, what are the students that people tend to spend a lot of time thinking about, tend to be very, I'm curious about is getting ready for Passover. It does remind me of one little joke that I'll tell you very quickly. I know you're looking at the clock, but I'll tell you very quickly. People clean everything for Passover. They clean the light sockets, they clean the water filters, everything gets cleaned for Pesach. So it happened, it's a true story. A friend of mine, his toilet seat broke on Passover. And so he had to, on Erev Pesach, take for Passover. So he had to take a bus from the Yaakov into Jerusalem, go to a hardware store, bought a new toilet seat, and he's riding home on the bus with the toilet seat over his shoulder, and 2 Hasidim are standing behind him, and one of them says to the other, that is a strange seat I have never seen before. So, at any rate, one of those mitzvot is how to prepare matzah, because it has to be, kneaded and baked within 18 minutes. There's all these, stringencies about it. And so they once have an Israel Salanter, okay, we're about to start preparation of matzah, what should we really concentrate on? He said, the most important thing you should do is you should not yell at the women who are kneading the dough. Especially this particular woman who is a widow. So forget about all the stringencies, the 18 minutes, things like that. It was all about how you treat the people who are working there. Similarly, there is an idea that when you wash you wash your hands before you eat bread, you should use a full buffer of water. It's supposed to be a segula for parnasa. It's supposed to be like kind of a small prayer that you should have a successful livelihood. Rabbi Salanter would always use the absolute minimum amount of water. And they asked him, why don't you use a full bucket of water? And he says, because someone has to carry the water up from the well for all of us to wash. So he would use the minimum amount so that somebody's always thinking about that other person. He used to say famously, that most people tend to think about their own gashes, their own material well-being, and other people's
it was like fucking golf ball size hail. How big is the hail, Joe? Golf ball size.
And he says, in reality, we should be concerned with our own well-being, our replaying property, and with other people's gashes, how other people are doing materially. Very much an emphasis on concern for others. Was one thing I actually have on my wall in my office is a statement of his that goes, not everything that is thought should be said, not everything that is said should be written down, not everything written down should be published. That was the motif for me. And one last example before we go back to where we were a second ago. He's famous for many kind of stories of encounters with ordinary people that left a lasting impression on him that he was able to convey to his students. So, for example, the story is told that he was once walking through the streets of the city late at night, and the city was dark, but there's one light burning, and he goes over to that window, looks inside, and sees there's a Jewish shoemaker there who's working on a project. project. And Rabbi Shlomo said to him, "What are you doing? It's like a teacher's living." And the man said to him, "Kol od hadar dolek, efshar litaken." As long as the candle is burning, it's possible to fix, it's possible to repair. And of course, Rabbi Yisrael took this as a metaphor for life. As long as our candle is burning, as long as we're still alive, we can still repair things. Son.
Roll
In terms of his, going back to this concept, he had a general, despite all this emphasis on between
I love this.
how they should treat each
Why
other,
this guy
he
opened
had
up the
what
door?
Emmanuel
So
Levinas calls a theosophic apathy. In other words, he was not interested in any of the ideas of what happens to the mitzvot when they're created, what about angels, what about demons. He's not interested at all, just interested in how am I supposed to behave, how am I supposed to orientate myself properly towards behavior. He once said that the Maharal of Prague, the great Rabbi Rabbi of Prague, is famed to have created a golem. You might know the anthropology.
Mark this, son.
He says that's
3,
an amazing thing,
2,
but it's even more amazing to
and
make
this
a
lady.
mensch.
I love her face.
That's so great. You can make a golem with Kabbalah, but let's try and make a mensch with the details we have.
Really?
Okay, let's go on from here. Oh my gosh, so much to talk about. Now, he's met with tremendous opposition. You know, everything sounds so obvious and worthwhile and so on, but at the time, definitely that was not the case. There was controversy over the fact that he established a Beit HaMussad, a house for Musar, which was kind of like, you know, basically an apartment.
It's me
And
rolling,
people would
son.
go there and they would spend an hour or two studying these books in groups, not like the joke that I told you to study individually. It was really designed to be something that you would be in a group setting and you would face a certain amount of peer pressure as people discuss these ideas in this little fashion. And this was considered something that was an unusual innovation that was feared for two reasons. One was it was thought that the creation of some kind of formalized study for just this subject, however crucial it was, would displace the role of the Talmud in the traditional curriculum. That somehow it was watering down the traditional study of the canonical texts, which it certainly did, but at the same time, it made it possible for people to feel much more meaning in their study than simply the technical study of the law codes itself. Secondly, they were also very concerned about the possibility that this might become a neo-Hasidic movement. Not Hasidic in the sense of its ideology, but Hasidic in the sense of this is yet another separatist movement where they are establishing separate places for study, and they are also engaged in some of those weird behaviors that the early Hasidim are criticized for, you know, singing while they were learning, strange gestures, periods of seclusion, and they were saying, you know, that many of the traditional Mechnakim felt this
one time,
these are all danger
my friend and I
signs.
was
Just
on
went
the
through
car.
this with the Hasidim, and they were saying, you don't want to go through this
I was
again.
driving.
Muslim movement.
We were in a
Ironically,
class
Muslim would
and
take over
this car was going to
the
hit us.
entire
I
white
drove.
movement, but at the time it was conceived to be very outside. One rabbi, whose name I won't mention, on his deathbed, he said, "I know for a certainty that despite my sins, I will go to heaven because I opposed the Muslim movement that, you know, fiercely." So that's a strange thing to say. Looking at it 20 years later, but there it is. Okay, he ended up fleeing Lithuania, as I mentioned earlier. First, he went to Kovno, which was nearby, also in Lithuania, primarily to avoid being involved in the Tsarist rabbinical seminary that I spoke to you earlier about. Kovno actually became much more of a stronghold for Musar than Vilna was. Kovno became a place where he established a special school called the Kollel de Perushim, the Kollel for those who separate, that had some impact in his own life, but much more so later on in life. He went from there to Prussia. At this point, we haven't talked too much about his family. I would like to return to them really towards the end of this lecture. But at this point, he was married in his youth, typical for his standing. He had several children. I don't know exactly how many offhand, but he left them in 1857 when he was now 47 years old, and he did not return. He maintained apparently a cordial relationship with them, visited them frequently, but basically this was the end of his family life, and we shall return to it. He was basically forced out of Russia because he felt that he could not control the pressures of the Haskalah on the movement there. They were bringing in experts from Western Europe, Germany in particular, like Max Lilienthal, to set up these schools. The heroic figure Moses Montefiore, who was, the famous figure behind the Damascus blood libel affair of 1840, rescuing the Jews of Damascus. He came to Russia and he expressed a pro-Haskalah position at the time. And since he was like the greatest folk hero of the Jews, Rabbi Salazar felt that he was unable to control the environment. He left for Russia. He may also have left for medical reasons, seeking treatment for his frequent bouts of depression, as we will conclude in a moment. He spent much of his time wandering around Russia, sometimes in Königsberg, lived in Berlin for a while, leading a variety of projects. At one point, he attempted to set up a massive commentary in the Talmud, not unlike the art scroll Schottenstein Shas, which is available today. That project came to naught, but it's interesting how his type of foresight. Finally, he ended his days in Paris in the 1870s, and he was called there initially to act as the moral head of that community, but it did not work out for them. He was already getting on in years, in his 70s, did not have quite the strength of the energy that he had when he was younger, and he fell out of favor with some of the authorities there. But he, at that time, stated a kind of an interesting perspective on his role there. He said that he had to leave Russia because it's like trying to stop horses rampaging down a hillside. It's impossible to stop them and turn them around when they're in full flight. When they get to the bottom, however, when they get to the valley and they stop, then it's possible to turn them around and get them walking back up the hill again. And so in that way, he was thinking about Russia as a place where the Jews were rapidly leaving their Jewish identity, whereas Paris, they had already largely abandoned it, and that it was a chance for him, now that everything is kind of settled down, to turn around and act really what we call the modern Cuban movement. He was undoubtedly the founder of Cuba in the sense that we have it today. Okay, I'm just going to rush through. I'll take questions in a minute because this is the last set of slides and then we'll be done. So as I mentioned, he had frequent recurring bouts of depression, sometimes acute depression. Rooted in his own correspondence, in some of the testimonials of the students. In one particular incident, towards the end of his life, he was asked to deliver a eulogy, and he got up before the audience, and he was silent for quite some time, and then he repeated one verse from the Torah over and over again. People who were there say about 50 times the verse referring to, that death is the ultimate end of man. This is Torah Sa'adam. And after repeating it 50 times in a sermon, he simply stopped speaking, got off the stage and left. And, this is indicative of kind of like this cycles of despair that we fall into. He felt deeply disappointed that Musar, as a body of thought and as a curriculum development, did not take off in Lithuania. He felt that it should be launched, much like the Hasidic movement had been launched. And he felt in many ways that he was inadequate to the task. Ironically, it would happen, but not in his lifetime. His ideas did take root. Interestingly, it took a few more decades before they were really flourished. But by the time you get to the beginning of the 20th century, there are several different varieties of Muslim yeshivas that are all interpreting his thought. And in fact, there would be no yeshivas that do not incorporate Musar in Lithuania afterwards. So he did achieve his goals, but not in his own lifetime. As I mentioned earlier, he left his wife and children in 1857 and has spent the last decades of his life traveling. He did go back for several visits, and we do have correspondence from him to his family, which indicates that the separation was amicable, and we understand, of course, the kind of circumstances that drove him out of Russia. but he had some difficult times with his children and his grandchildren in particular. One son went on to university and became a great scientist, a molecular chemist, if I remember correctly. And the masculine, the war with Haskalah is still very much going on at this time. The masculine made a big deal out of the fact that here the son of the great famed Rabbi has become a scientist. This shows his open attitude towards science, modernity, and the Haskalah in general. Now, this is not so far from the truth. He definitely was interested in the general sciences. He studied chemistry at one point himself, psychology, as we mentioned, but he was trained and he was pained by this characterization of his son's success as a scientist as condoning those studies. And so he actually published a response to the publications of the Masculine celebrating his son's achievements, indicating that his son was a disappointment to him and that he had tried to convince him not to engage in those studies and so on. It's a complex, conflicted moment, and difficult to place that into the larger context, but this class is not a sermon. This is a history class at any rate. Finally, his grandson also went to Western Europe, and his grandfather, Israel Salanter, begged him to keep kosher and gave him additional stipends to buy kosher food because the grandson complained it's too expensive. Then he set him up with a family to make sure he would keep kosher, but it appears that all was not. And with that particular grandson. And so Rabbi Salanter was dealing with these facts of his own lineage that betrayed some of the principles that he espoused. So taken together with his self-recrimination over the failure of the movement to succeed during his lifetime, we can see perhaps why that would drive him into the Great Depression. Nevertheless, his legacy is deeply profound. His legacy is one of perhaps the 10 most influential thinkers of the Jewish world in the 19th century. And although he may have ended his life with a negative self-assessment, there's no question that he contributed massively to the development of this very important ethical school in Judaism, one that finds expression today in all of the yeshivot across the spectrum, and in fact has made penetration into the secular world as well. So with that, I'm going to conclude. I'll take questions afterwards, but thank you very much for your attention and your endurance. Next week at 8:30 p.m., we're going to go back to Western Europe, and we're going to look at the great Jewish poet Heinrich Heine, fascinating figure of world-class stature. Thank you for your attention. Push the off button. That's it.
I love this cat scratch.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I don't recall. Did I tell you the joke about the Hadassah group in Fort Lauderdale that bought a jet fighter for the Israeli Armed Forces? Neighbors? Okay, good. If it's vaguely familiar, that's all right. Okay, just don't blurt out the punchline at the end. It goes like this. So there's a very important women's group, Hadassah, in Fort Lauderdale, and they work very hard. They raise a lot of money to buy an F-15 jet fighter for the Israeli Air Force, and they raised $2 billion to buy one of these amazing pieces of war machinery, and they get it, they purchase it, and they're going to have a big ceremony at Fort Lauderdale Airport to watch it go on its maiden flight to the Holy Land. And they have bleachers set up on the tarmac with all kinds of dignitaries from the Israeli government, the American government, of course, all the membership of Hadassah and their husbands are sitting there, and the Israeli pilot gives them a big salute, holding his helmet under his arm. He goes up into the cockpit, he shuts the cowling, fires up these massive jet engines, and the jet shoots down the runway and stops. And it turns around, and it shoots down the runway the other way, and then stops. This happens about 3-4 times. Finally, it taxis all the way up to the stands. The pilot gets out. He walks down the little gangplank there. He goes up to the president of the Hadassah. He says to her, "Madam, I'm very sorry, the plane will not take off. We must remove at least some of the plaques. That's fine. It's hard to hear laughter because this microphone's so small, but it really is happening. Okay, so tonight's lecture is kind of interesting. We're going to look at Solomon Maimon. Very important 18th century figure in the history of philosophy. Not quite as important in the history of the Jewish people as a contributor, perhaps, to the cultural heritage of Judaism, but definitely as a kind of placeholder to understand a major phenomenon that was developing in the 18th century and continued pace into the 19th century. Specifically, Solomon Maimon is someone who went off the derech, so to speak, someone who rejected the traditional mores of Judaism, but he had, which was still comparatively rare in the 18th century, but he had a very acerbic wit and a very ready pen, and he left behind a literary description of his travels, which are absolutely fascinating reading. It doesn't necessarily make you like Solomon Maimon. I definitely liked him less after having reviewed his autobiography, but nevertheless, you get a view into his personality and into the intellectual challenges and struggles of his age in a very, very vivid and powerful manner. So I highly recommend this. It's a little book. It's only about 150 pages, the autobiography of Solomon Maimon, in which he describes his intellectual journey, the reasons for that journey, at least as he perceived them, and the various figures that he met along the way, the Talmudist, the Kabbalist, the Chassid, the Maskil. He met a whole range of people who were expressing their Jewish identity in many different fashions, and he came up with his own solution, which was a problematic one, yet one that is still preferred by many today. Which reminds me of another joke. I don't normally tell two in the first 5 minutes, but I can't help it. I always forget this one. Did I tell you one about the yeshiva bacher who goes to Warsaw in the 1920s and comes back home to America? So his father sends him to Warsaw to learn Torah properly, and an old European yeshiva. And then he comes back after the Zman is over, after a few months, sits down at the Shabbos table, and so the father says, so what was it like? He says, it was really confusing. When I was over there, I met a Jew who was a communist. I met a Jew who was a Talmudist. I met a Jew who was a Chassid. I met a Jew who was a Zionist, a Jew who was atheist. And he says, well, what do you expect? Warsaw's a big town. There's a lot of diversity. He says, no, Dad, it was the same Jew. So we're looking at manifold descriptions of identity, many of them mutually exclusive, and I think Solomon Maimon's approach to life is one that's quite instructive, perhaps as a moral lesson to us. So here's a picture of him. He was born in 1753 or 1754 in what is today Belarus, was Poland at the time, and through his peregrinations, he spent most of his time as an adult in Germany, where he made his fame. He was most well known as a philosopher. This is the era of the late Enlightenment, and he was a contemporary of Kant. And in fact, the great Immanuel Kant said of him, after he looked at one of his publications, that no one understands my work better than my work. Rather amazing level of praise from one of the greatest philosophers of the 18th century. Now, it's true that in the history of philosophy, Maimon is only a second or perhaps a third-rate philosopher, but if first-rate are people like Immanuel Kant and before him Leibniz, that's a very, very high level. To be second-rate on that kind of level is something quite significant. And we won't go into his philosophy in great detail today because it has very little contribution to Judaism, although it is related to Spinoza's theories in many ways. But we're going to concentrate on the aspects of his life which touch on his Jewish identity and his personal experiences. So his family background, fairly typical background for Jews in Eastern Europe at the time. His grandfather was a leaseholder for the Polish prince Radziwill. If you recall in previous lectures, we talked about this a little bit, where you have this situation where you have a Polish nobleman who owned vast tracts of land called Latifundia, often populated by non-Poles who were the farmers, in this case Belarusians, in other cases Ukrainians, for example, and the Jews were in this kind of difficult situation of being the leaseholders, where they would collect taxes. It's also known as tax farming. They would collect taxes of various sorts: tolls, income taxes, produce taxes, bills for hunting in the manor and things like that, and then they would forward a portion of that tax to the prince, who actually literally owned the territory. In return, theoretically, the Jews were supposed to guarantee the maintenance of those properties. I mean, that was part of the whole reason, or at least the pretense of the taxation was not really to make the owner of the latifundia wealthy. It was intended to improve the lives of everyone there, at least in theory. And so the Jew, who was the leaseholder, was often under very difficult circumstances, trapped between an often hostile peasantry and a far-off poritz or lord who did not care about the needs of the larger population. And so the Jews were proximate to the causes of potential unrest, and yet were often helpless to allay the needs and fears of the local population. To give one example that Maimon provides in his autobiography, there was a certain bridge in his grandfather's leaseholding area that was always falling under tremendous disrepair. And quite frequently, whenever anyone drove a carriage over that bridge, it would often overturn, and all of its occupants would be dumped into the mud. And at which point, all of the local farmers and the Jewish innkeeper, who was, of course, the grandfather, would flee for their lives because the angry Lord would come out and would take retribution on the local inhabitants for not maintaining the bridge properly. This happened quite often. And in fact, Solomon Maimon, as a child, was once beaten terribly, so was his own father, under these kinds of circumstances, and yet the grandfather could never get the funds from the Lord to be able to repair the bridge. And through his rather wanted economy, he was never able to really succeed as a leaseholder. Ultimately, he was driven from the farm for reasons which we won't go into right here, but that reduced the family to penury, and Maimon's father, Joshua, who was a Talmudist, a scholar, was reduced to working in schools as a tutor. During the 18th century, you will recall, there is no formal public education for Jews. Education is primarily delivered by private tutors in middle-class to upper-middle-class homes. You would find these itinerant preachers who often had a very limited knowledge of the Torah themselves, and they were often known as youth mentions, meaning people who lived on air, and they would never actually had an economic classification. Farmers, merchants, doctors, lawyers, etc., and then you had in the Jewish population so-called youth mentions. No readily visible means for them to be supported, and they would find their living primarily by begging, by small-time commerce, or in the case of Joshua, through tutoring middle-class families. This is ultimately something that Solomon Maimon made most of his own career out of, right to the very end of his short life. He died at the age of 46. His principal source of income were the occasional teaching jobs that he found for children in the homes of wealthy individuals. And I'd like to describe to you, here's a passage from his autobiography. It's widely quoted in many anthologies of Jewish history and of 18th century history because it's written in a very lively style, and it provides quite a vivid image of what life must have been like. So here is Maimon's description of a typical school, if one could call it that, in the 18th century. I must now say something of the condition of Jewish schools in general. The school is commonly a small smoky hut, and the children are scattered, some on benches, some on the bare earth. The master, in a dirty blouse sitting on the table, holds between his knees a bowl in which he grinds tobacco into snuff with a huge pestle like the club of Hercules, while at the same time he wields his authority. The ushers give lessons, each in his own corner, and rule those under their charge quite as despotically as the master himself. Of the breakfast, lunch, and other food sent to the school for the children, these gentlemen keep the largest share for themselves. Sometimes the poor youngsters get nothing at all, and yet they dare not make any complaints on the subject, subject, for if they will not expose themselves to the vengeance of these tyrants. Here the children are imprisoned from morning to night and have not an hour to themselves except on Friday and a half holiday at the new moon. As far as study is concerned, the reading of Hebrew is regularly taught. On the other hand, very seldom is any progress made toward the mastery of the Hebrew language. Grammar is not taught in school at all, but has to be learned by translation of the Holy Scriptures, very much as the ordinary man learns imperfectly the grammar of his mother tongue by social intercourse. Moreover, there is no dictionary of the Hebrew language. The children therefore begin at once with the exploration of the Bible. This is divided into many sections. Okay, actually, I just skip on right now. But the point is, very unsystematic, very unprofessional, cruel. He certainly has a very dark and a negative impression of that. And that's, in fact, how he describes much of his early education. One more note about his family background, we will return to this a little later. His mother apparently suffered some unspecified mental illness, which may have been some kind of anxiety disorder brought on by the frequent wanderings of the family from job to job, and she died very young. In his autobiography, one of the less likable aspects of Maimon is that in 150 pages, he only mentions his mother a couple of times in passing, his wife not many times more, and only once in a rather positive light. All of the other ones describe his wife as shrewish and someone that he wished to abandon. In fact, he did abandon her when he was 25. And we know he has allusions to having several children, but he names none of them, and we don't even know how many children he had with his young wife. So he's not especially attached to family at all. And this is not a work of great scholarship where he's discussing philosophical ideas and so on. This is a book about his own life, and yet his own particular circumstances receive such short shrift. He seems to have a little bit, in my humble opinion, of a kind of a narcissistic personality disorder where he's thinking all about himself and about how he's misunderstood and so on. But I'm no psychologist, so let's go on. His early education was marked by brilliance. He was, without doubt, he was really quite talented. By some accounts, he actually was a rabbi at 11, which is very hard to understand because you can't even get an aliyah of Torah at the age of 11. But he was married at 11 as well. That's also very suspect. But there's no question that he was widely regarded as a brilliant student of the Talmud and was readily hired and sought out as a marriage partner because of his great facility with his ancient texts. He makes a great deal out of the analysis of the social structure of the Jewish community in 18th century Poland, and he emphasizes the huge advantage that mastery of this text poses for social stature. And he leveraged that to his greatest ability, trying to make sure that he would be fed and then, in fact, be able to engage in more history of ideas. But his talent for the Talmud is not much discussed. He spends about a chapter talking about what the Talmud is. I should underline, by the way, that this book was written in German for non-Jews. He's not writing an inside story. He's writing for a wider audience, a kind of like, this is, how the Jews live. This is a quaint kind of picture into Jewish culture, primarily for a non-Jewish audience. So he does spend a chapter on the Talmud. He discusses, as we looked at last week when we talked about the Vilna Gaon, he discusses the somewhat caustic and unhelpful nature of pilpul as an intellectual activity. And then he basically moves on from it and doesn't discuss much more at all. What really fascinated him was the forbidden knowledge in secular subjects, which is completely closed to him. Literally, in fact, because the place where his father kept a handful of small Hebrew translations of certain scientific works was a cupboard in the bedroom that young Solomon shared with his grandmother. And this cupboard was closed, and he was specifically instructed not to open it, not to look at these books, which included, for example, a history of the Jews, a secular history of the Jews, a few tractates on the phases of the moon and astronomy and so on. But Maimon was simply too precocious to resist, and so at the age of 7, he would insist on, after everyone had gone to sleep, he would light a tallow candle, and he would open up this cupboard, disturbing his grandmother, who complained bitterly about being kept up at night by his grandson reading. I wish we all had that problem, being kept up at night by our kids reading science textbooks. But he would go through these, and he was ultimately discovered because in one of these, the astronomical textbooks, the author indicated that because we're going to be talking about spheres and orbits, it would be helpful if everyone would construct for themselves, the readers would construct for themselves a kind of a globe to illustrate the pictures. And so he took some reeds from outside and made for himself a ball of reeds, which might have appeared as a toy to others, but when his father questioned him on it, and he said it is a kadur, it is a ball, he realized what his son was up to. And although he forbade him from reading the textbooks, he still had something of a smile on his face at the time. So he had this this desire for the forbidden secular studies that really stayed with him through his entire life. And throughout this period, he's growing and learning until by age 11, as we shall see, he was actually considered by at least the ignorant townsfolk as a rabbi and suitable for a marriage prospect. So here I'm going to tell you a little bit of his marriage, which is absolutely amazing. He was engaged twice, well, actually more than twice, but the first time the bride died before the second engagement was a rather fascinating situation where there was a widow who kept him in. It's a very common profession for Jews in the 18th century. It goes along with householding. They would maintain a public house for travelers. They would often have a monopoly on the sale of alcohol. And so there was this widow who had one of these kids. She had a young daughter, just a few years older than Maimon. She was probably 14 at the time. And he refers to both of them in the most negative of terms, being very argumentative. He describes scenes later when he's married, and every meal is accompanied by the throwing of food and cutlery and so on at each other. But what happened was his father was constantly begged by this widow to betroth his son to her daughter. He constantly refused until once she engineered it that when the father was staying at the inn on his way to another teaching job with the young man, with Solomon, the widow invited the town rabbi and made a presentation as if the engagement had already been decided upon. This caused quite a scene because there was a lot of misunderstandings, and ultimately the father agreed to Joshua to give away his son Solomon at a great price. It was going to be a huge dowry that was going to be given to Solomon for marrying this young woman. And so, he just essentially gave in and gave away his son. Then they went home. Weeks went by, and no news about the dowry. The money's not coming in. The presents that were promised, the set of Talmud, the special hat, things like that, nothing was coming in. And then another offer came up, which was rather quite interesting. There was a local farmer, a Jewish farmer, who also had a daughter, and he saw that Maimon's father was really not very good with money. And so, even though Maimon had several times refused to marry off his son Solomon to the daughter of the farmer who was much more thrifty and much more of savings, he engineered it to loan Joshua Maimon. By the way, that wasn't their last name. That wasn't their family name. They were known simply as Joshua ben, I forget what his father's name is, Solomon ben Joshua. When he went to Germany, Solomon took the last name Maimon in honor of Maimonides as his surname. At any rate, the farmer loaned Joshua a large sum of money, and as expected, Joshua proved unable to repay that debt. And so then the farmer said, listen, I'll tell you what, this is a huge debt. You can't repay it unless we work something out where you have your son marry my daughter, and I'll forgive the debt, and I'll give you 50 talers on top of it. Joshua said yes. even though his son was already engaged to the widow's daughter. And then this happened. It happened that a few weeks later, they all found themselves at the widow's inn, where the farmer was announcing that, in fact, his daughter was going to be engaged to Solomon Lyman. The widow said that's impossible because she's going to be married. He's going to be married to my daughter, and there was a huge suit. And we're not sure how it would have worked out, but in the ensuing chaos, Solomon's mother died. Mother passed away. Now listen to this. It's absolutely amazing. And you can just hear his tone because he says in the middle of this, meanwhile, my mother died and was brought to Neski for burial. There's only 2 references really to his mother in the entire book, and here it's just meanwhile my mother died. But anyways, my mother-in-law, meaning the widow, obtained from the court an attachment on the dead body by which its interment was interdicted until the termination of the suit. Meaning, she put a lien on the body of Solomon's mother, saying it could not be buried until he settled this lawsuit. It's just amazing to read. My father was therefore compelled to appear in court. My mother-in-law, of course, gained the suit, and I became again the bridegroom of my former bride. This is at 11 years old, this is written. And now, to prevent any similar reversal of her plans in the future, and to take from my father all occasion for it, my mother-in-law endeavored to satisfy all his demands in accordance with the promise, clothing me from top to toe, and even pay my father for my board from the day of the betrothal to the marriage. My mother was also now married, and we returned home again. The second father-in-law came too, and called upon my father to ratify his contract. My father, however, pointed out that it was null and void, as it contravened a previous contract, and had been made by him merely on the supposition that my mother-in-law had no intention of fulfilling hers. The Arendam farmer seemed to yield to the necessity of reconciling himself to the loss, but in reality he was thinking of some means to get me into his hands. Accordingly, he rose by night, yoked his horses, took me in silence from the table on which I was sleeping, packed me with all dispatch into his carriage, and made off with his booty through the gate. But as this could not be accomplished without some noise, the people in the house awoke, discovered the theft, pursued the kidnapper, and snatched me out of his hands. To me, the whole incident appeared at the time like a dream. In this way, my father was released from his debt and got 50 tailors besides as a gratuity, but I was immediately afterwards carried off by my legal mother-in-law and made the husband of my legal bride. I must, of course, confess that this transaction of my father's did not quite be justified from a moral point of view. Only his great need at the time can, in some measure, serve as an excuse. Still, a rather amazing story. Gives you a lot of sense of the color of the times, the putting the lien on the body of the mother, the kidnapping, the arrangements for the shidduchim. It doesn't turn out well for him. He immediately has a terrible relationship with the young bride. There's some somewhat euphemistic language for his awkwardness as a 11-year-old boy fulfilling some of the marital duties of a husband. And very soon after they're married, he takes off and starts serving as an itinerant tutor around town and around the environments, coming home only for the high holidays. Amazingly, during this time, his wife becomes pregnant several times over the years, but he will ultimately abandon her at age 25 when he leaves for Königsberg for good. And we'll get back to her pursuit of him towards the end of the story.
And go.
There we go. So, during this time, his studies are increasing apace. He is a tremendous autodidact. He has no teacher who's capable of, instructing him, and he feels especially hampered because he knows no European language. Unless you want to count Yiddish and a smattering of Polish, he really knows no European language, and the one that he needs the most is, of course, German, the language of high culture. And so he finds a few scraps, literally scraps of German books, and he teaches himself the language from the pieces that he's discovered. He is terribly embarrassed, however, because he never, even to the end of his life, masters German pronunciation. He completely butchers the German language because he didn't know exactly how to pronounce each letter. Later on in life, when he's put to the test, because he'll show up in a town and he'll look for some kind of work, people will think that he's an ignoramus and they'll ask him to read some kind of German text. He will read it to great laughter because everyone will find his pronunciation very quaint and humorous, but they won't believe that he understands what he's saying. It's like a monkey parroting sounds. But when they ask him to translate it into Hebrew, then he's able to demonstrate that in fact he understands the text perfectly. He simply cannot pronounce it properly, which was something that he struggled with throughout his entire life. Still, with his rudimentary German, he goes on a search of any kind of teacher or material that he can find. And he's just
Look how blue the
described
sky
fact
used
that
to be.
once he walked 150 miles to examine a particular book. He was literally on his feet for months at a time, in the same clothes for weeks without washing them, going from town to town, just trying to pick up tidbits of knowledge, pieces of knowledge from various locations in a very, penurious environment. It's at this time, so now he's about 17 years old, 16 years old, and he encounters the Kabbalah. And you'll recall, as in our discussion, perhaps in the Vilna Gaon, or maybe even earlier, that the traditional Lithuanian approach to Kabbalah is that these mystical sciences are reserved for the elite. Only after, massive completion of great amounts of Talmudic data is a person permitted to even consider looking at the Kabbalah. He happens to come across a few scraps of books, though, once again, and he finds it absolutely fascinating, especially the Kabbalah of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, which is something that I've been spending a lot of my own research time working on lately as well. And he is delighted, because unlike the Talmud, which is mainly concerned with either practical behavior, the derivation of Jewish law, or a rather unstructured and extremely diverse description of the universe in all its diversity, biographies, recipes, stories, popular sayings, all mixed in a very difficult kind of confusion of ideas, but fascinating and all connected well together, and very difficult to find the thread that puts them all together. Kabbalah, especially Cordovero Kabbalah, is much more organized and is an attempt to describe the metaphysical structure of the universe from A to Z. And he was completely taken with it. He loved it, and he became a very devoted Kabbalist for a few years. He then moved to the Kabbalah of the Arizal, which is the student of the Moshe Cordovero, and he became quite fascinated with theurgic or practical Kabbalah, in which he hoped through the arts to be able to affect various magical effects in the world. In particular, he describes in great humor his tremendous studies to make himself invisible, into which he would study these particular passages from the Zohar and other holy books, and he would mutter these incantations, and then he would walk into the synagogue and stand very close to his friends and wait to see if they recognize him. Of course, they didn't recognize him. They would ask him questions. They would say, "Do you understand what he says in this book here?" And he was constantly disappointed that he simply could not make himself invisible. Ultimately, he will abandon the Kabbalah as an area of research for himself, but he did acknowledge that, compared to modern philosophy, Spinoza's thought was really quite derivative and second-rate compared to the Kabbalistic structure of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. We're halfway through, so let me pause and take a couple of questions. If someone has hard questions, but easy questions.
And you don't think they can't understand
Is
us.
Abramson? Not yet. I'm trying to drink coffee.
No.
Nobody has a question. Okay, should I think of a joke? I have a joke actually, thinking about, it's a little bit of black humor, but the joke goes like this. A guy goes to cover Kedusha and he says, I need some financial help to bury my wife. Unfortunately, my wife passed away. and I can't afford the funeral, so I need some help. So the head of Chabradisha says, no problem. Very understanding. What's your name? He says his name. He looks up and he says, wait a second. We already gave you money to bury your wife 2 years ago. He says, yeah, that was my first wife. He said, then the guy says, oh, you got remarried. He says, yeah, I got remarried. Awesome, Tom. That's a joke. I didn't say it right. All you people in Latvia, I'll try to get there next time. Solomon Miner is about 500 years later, so there's not much connection. He's walking a lot. That's pretty much what he has in common with Benjamin and Tudela. More than 500 years, but he's otherwise not connected. Mr. Rodriguez, he married the daughter of the innkeeper.
Hey, goodbye. Here. Kneecaps, chucklehead.
No, kidnapping did not work. He got sent back to the first one. Okay, Ms. Abramson, we're ready now.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would. The question is, why didn't he eventually get the pronunciation? I don't know. He, I guess when you learn a language like myself, I'm not a native Yiddish speaker at all. I learned it later in life, and I learned it in college after I learned German. So when I speak Yiddish, my friend said to me, please don't speak Yiddish because you sound like a Nazi. So you get certain pronunciation tics and you can't get rid of them. So, okay, yes, last question on the way.
What was that?
It's a dramatic language in essence. I can't imagine why he would have so much trouble with pronunciation. Perhaps he has something to do with his hearing.
Well, perhaps it might have something to do with his hearing, but I think it's more like the distinction between Yiddish and German in pronunciation. It's probably a little bit like accents in English. Like there's a kind of standard American accent, the Midwestern accent that's very popular with news announcers and things like that. It's the one closest, of course, to the Canadian dialect, and that's why it's preferred, it's the clearest, and
Watch out for the two guys, Josh.
they can talk about whatever they want, that kind of thing. But nobody got that except for maybe Elisa. But if you have a really strong Brooklyn accent, and then you go speak on the news, then people will laugh because it's such a strong accent, Texas accent.
Look at that Coke now.
It's more like that.
Really?
Still very
Oh, fun stuff.
Let's go on then. Okay, so
Are you done?
it's at this point in time when he begins in his biography to describe his slow, steady descent out of traditional Judaism. In particular, he has a friend named Moses Lapidot, and it's kind of interesting that he's getting no feelings of satisfaction from his home life with his child bride and her difficult mother, and the only kind of friendship camaraderie he has is with this person on the outside, Moses Lapidot. The two of them are comrades in philosophy, as he describes them, and they meet up with each other quite regularly. Again, they don't have regular jobs. They're tutors, and they find a couple hours here, a couple hours there, maybe a whole day with this family, and it's just a catch and catch can kind of environment. And at some point, they begin to say, we like each other's company so much, we're not getting schmuck out of the rest of our lives, so maybe we should just change our lives to move in this direction. I'll read you one passage that I found very telling, where he says,
Where's that Colonial Pub?
this is Maimonides talking.
Hang on, man.
I'm talking about Maimonides. He was a big student of Maimonides. He wrote a commentary, by the way, on the Guide for the Perplexed as well. I had by this time obtained from Maimonides more accurate ideas of God and of our duties towards him.